Cedar Grove is a small town nestled among the peaceful fields of the American Midwest. With a population of only a few thousand people, it has always been considered a close-knit community where everyone knows each other. The old-style houses, long roads, and the quiet atmosphere made it seem like Cedar Grove would never face any major upheavals. However, in that September, a horrific crime shattered the town's peace, leaving everyone talking about it nonstop. The Thompson family was one of the most well-known families in Cedar Grove. Jack Thompson, a talented real estate entrepreneur, had built a successful empire, bringing his family a life of luxury. With his good looks, refined manners, and stable career, Jack was respected by everyone. His wife, Grace Thompson, owned a high-end fashion boutique in town. She was known for her exquisite taste and her radiant smile, which always made customers feel special when they stepped into her shop. Living next door to the Thompsons was the Miller family, a couple who had recently moved from the city. David Miller was a literature professor at a local university, and his wife Emma was a talented landscape architect. The couple had a 22-year-old son, Michael Miller, who was studying environmental science at a nearby university. Wanting to find peace and escape the hustle and bustle of the city, the Millers had chosen Cedar Grove as their new home. Everyone in town believed that the lives of these families were perfect, but behind the facade were dark secrets no one could have imagined. Since moving to Cedar Grove, Michael Miller had felt that life in the small town was boring and lonely. He had no friends in this tiny community, other than the occasional short conversations with his parents and the occasional encounters with elderly neighbors. The slow-moving summer days made him spend more time on his studies and his environmental conservation project in a nearby forest. The neighborhood party that June, hosted by the Thompson family, was one of the highlights of the community. The Thompsons were known for their generosity and social nature, and this party was no exception. Their house was beautifully decorated, the garden was filled with twinkling lights, and everyone came with joy and excitement. Michael was not particularly excited about the party. He felt out of place among the older guests discussing work, wealth, and other topics that didn't interest him. While his parents quickly blended into the crowd, Michael quietly slipped away to find a quieter spot. He stepped into the backyard of the Thompson house, where soft yellow lights illuminated the meticulously cared-for garden. There, Michael met Grace. She stood alone, her distant gaze fixed on the garden, her face filled with sadness and contemplation. Unlike her usual public appearances, Grace no longer had her familiar radiant smile that evening. It seemed as if she was carrying a burden that no one else knew about. Michael hesitated for a few moments before deciding to approach her. "This party is boring, isn't it?" Michael said, trying to break the silence. Grace was startled, turning to look at Michael before giving a faint smile. "Yeah," she replied softly, her voice carrying a weariness beneath the surface. "Parties like this may seem perfect on the outside, but inside, it's not always the case." Michael could sense the emptiness in Grace's voice. It made him curious and sympathetic. The two stood silently side by side for a few minutes, with only the sound of rustling leaves and distant music filling the air. "You don't like parties, do you?" Grace finally spoke, breaking the silence. Michael shook his head. "Not really. I just don't feel like I belong here." Grace smiled again, this time more sincerely. "Me neither," she said, dropping the formalities. "Sometimes I feel lost in this life too." Their conversation began from there. At first, it was just small talk about hobbies and work, but over time, Michael and Grace became closer. Every conversation, every meeting became a moment for both of them to escape the world around them. Michael was quickly drawn to Grace's charm, while she found comfort in having someone who listened and cared, something Jack had long stopped doing. Their meetings became more frequent. Grace started inviting Michael over under the pretense of helping with the garden. Sometimes, they would just sit on the porch, drinking tea and talking. These meetings seemed innocent enough, but there was an undeniable tension beneath the surface. Michael knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he couldn't stop thinking about Grace. Then, on a rainy day in July, the inevitable happened. Michael went to Grace's house to discuss the garden project. Jack was away on a business trip, and the house was empty except for the two of them. As the rain poured down outside, they sat in the living room. The sound of the rain, the stifling air, and Grace's sad eyes created a charged atmosphere. She looked at Michael, and in a moment of weakness, they kissed. From that moment on, their relationship crossed a new boundary. Michael was initially shocked, but his long-suppressed feelings overwhelmed him, and he couldn't resist. They gave in to their passions, oblivious to the consequences. They both knew they were making a mistake, but in that moment, they chose to forget reality. On September 15th, Cedar Grove sweltered under the autumn heat. But that day, the town's peace was shattered by a gruesome discovery. Jack Thompson, the famous real estate entrepreneur, was found dead in his own home. His body lay motionless on the bedroom floor, his head severely injured, with blood pooling around him. That morning, Jack had left the house early to prepare for an important meeting with business partners. He was working on a major deal that could help solidify the real estate empire he had painstakingly built. But by the afternoon, when Jack failed to show up for the meeting and couldn't be reached, his colleagues began to worry. One of them called the house, but Grace said her husband had not returned home. She suggested that Jack might have forgotten the meeting due to his usual busy schedule. However, as Jack still didn't appear and his phone remained unreachable, one of his colleagues decided to visit the Thompson house to check on him. When he arrived, the front door was unlocked. After calling out with no response, the colleague pushed the door open and was greeted by a horrifying sight. Jack's body lay on the floor, motionless in a large pool of blood. Grace rushed home as soon as she received the news from Jack's colleague. She hurried into the bedroom, where the police had already started investigating the scene. Grace's face was pale, her eyes brimming with tears, but she tried to remain calm. Detective Sarah Collins, who quickly arrived on the scene, noticed that Grace didn't seem particularly shocked. Sarah, a sharp investigator with many years of experience solving tough cases, immediately sensed something was off in Grace's statement, but there wasn't enough evidence at the time to raise any suspicions. At first, the case was believed to be a murder with a romantic motive. The injuries on Jack's head suggested that he had been attacked with a blunt object, possibly the overturned bedside lamp near his body. However, what was strange was that there were no signs of a break-in, and everything in the house seemed untouched. This led the police to suspect that the killer might have been someone Jack knew. When questioned by the police, Grace Thompson explained that Jack had left the house early that morning, and she was not at the scene when the crime occurred. Grace claimed that she had been at her fashion boutique all afternoon, busy with customers. She insisted that when she returned home, she had only received the call from Jack's colleague and immediately rushed back. Meanwhile, Michael Miller was also summoned for questioning. Since the fateful events of July, Michael had tried to avoid Grace, but conflicting emotions of love and guilt constantly toward him. On the day of Jack's death, Michael had been home in the afternoon, but he had no clear alibi. Michael claimed that he had been working on a school project all day. This made him a suspect, despite his attempts to distance himself from Grace after the incident. However, there was something Michael and Grace didn't know. David Miller, Michael's father, had been secretly observing everything. David had long suspected the illicit relationship between Grace and Michael, but he never said anything and chose to quietly watch their behavior. One sleepless night, David discovered that Jack was planning to divorce Grace and transfer all his assets out of her control. This not only threatened Grace's financial future, but also risked exposing her relationship with Michael. Faced with this reality, David Miller decided to act. On the night Jack was killed, David snuck into the Thompson house, taking advantage of Grace's absence, and attacked Jack. David's actions were brutal, but he rationalized them as the only way to keep everything under control. However, David's plan wasn't perfect. He left behind some evidence at the scene, and Detective Sarah Collins soon noticed inconsistencies in Grace's and Michael's statements. Sarah began digging deeper into the relationship between Grace and Michael, and she uncovered secret emails between Jack and an unknown woman, which further complicated the case. Taking charge of the investigation into Jack Thompson's murder, Detective Sarah Collins tackled the case with her usual meticulousness and determination. Calm yet assertive, Sarah had over 15 years of experience, having solved some of the most difficult cases. From the beginning, Sarah sensed that this was not just a simple murder case, but rather a series of complex events involving more people than it appeared on the surface. Detective Collins began the investigation by thoroughly examining the crime scene. Jack's bedroom showed signs of a struggle, but what caught Sarah's attention the most was the overturned lamp, which seemed to have been the weapon that caused Jack's fatal injuries. However, there were no clear fingerprints on the lamp, and everything in the room had been carefully cleaned, as if someone had tried to cover up their tracks. Sarah called Grace Thompson in for another round of questioning, this time with more specific questions. Grace tried to remain calm, but Sarah could see the unease in her subtle gestures. Grace reiterated that she had been at her store all day and had not been home when Jack was killed. However, when Sarah asked her to provide clear evidence of her presence at the store all afternoon, Grace began to falter. One of Grace's employees testified that Grace had left the store around noon and hadn't returned until the evening, right around the time Jack was murdered. Sarah continued to investigate Michael Miller, the young neighbor she had noticed from the beginning. During the first round of questioning, Michael seemed nervous and anxious, but he firmly denied any involvement in the murder. Michael claimed that he had been working on his school project at home all day. However, what made Sarah suspicious was the inconsistency between Michael's statement and some of the evidence she had uncovered. Other neighbors had seen Michael's car parked near the Thompson house on the afternoon of the murder. One witness even claimed to have seen Michael entering the Thompson house, despite his attempts to avoid attention. Sensing something was amiss, Sarah began to probe deeper into Michael and Grace's relationship. A series of secret emails and text messages between Michael and Grace were discovered on their phones. These messages revealed that not only did they have an intimate relationship, but they had also been meeting secretly for the past few months. Grace, in a moment of weakness, had confided in Michael about her unhappy marriage with Jack, and the two had been drawn into a dangerous affair. David Miller, Michael's father, also caught Sarah's attention. Although David had not been suspected before, he had remained cold and reserved throughout the investigation. When Sarah began looking into David, she discovered that he had known about his son's relationship with Grace but had never mentioned it. This raised Sarah's suspicion, as it was clear that David had reasons to withhold information or even protect his son from being implicated. Meanwhile, Sarah had the forensics team re-examine Jack's room, and this time, they found small traces of blood in one corner of the room, where it appeared that someone had tried to clean it up but failed. DNA analysis showed that the blood belonged to Jack, but there was also a small unidentified trace, possibly providing a crucial lead. The secret emails between Jack and an unknown woman, signed M, also began to reveal new secrets. In their final exchanges, Jack had disclosed that he was planning to divorce Grace and transfer all his assets out of her control. This led Sarah to question whether Grace had known about Jack's plan and conspired to kill him to seize his fortune. However, the clues started to point the investigation in a different direction. As Sarah delved deeper into the identity of M, she discovered that the woman was none other than Emma Miller, David's wife and Michael's mother. This opened up a whole new dimension. Emma had been having a secret relationship with Jack for years, and when she found out that Jack intended to divorce Grace to be with her, it could have triggered a complex web of criminal plots involving several of the key figures. The question now was not just who had killed Jack, but what the real motive behind his death was. Sarah felt that the case was becoming increasingly complicated, with multiple people having motives to kill Jack. Grace wanted to keep the assets and hide her affair with Michael. Michael may have acted out of jealousy or been manipulated by Grace. David Miller had reasons to protect his son and Emma, while Emma had her own motive for wanting Jack out of the picture. Sarah knew she had to move quickly to close this investigation before more secrets were exposed, causing further consequences for all involved. Detective Sarah Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger lay behind Jack Thompson's death. The clues she had gathered, from the illicit affair between Grace and Michael to Jack's secret emails with Emma, David Miller's wife, painted a far more complicated picture than she had initially imagined. As Sarah dug deeper into the relationship between Jack and Emma, unexpected truths began to surface. In their final emails, Jack spoke of his plans to divorce Grace and build a new life with Emma, something Grace clearly wasn't aware of. On the other hand, Emma had begun to regret her affair with Jack, but that didn't change the fact that she had become entangled in a deadly conspiracy. David Miller, whom Sarah hadn't initially suspected, now emerged as a central figure in the story. Sarah began digging into David's past and noticed that he had undergone significant psychological changes in the time leading up to Jack's death. David, a quiet and reserved man, seemed to know more about his son's relationship with Grace as well as Jack and Emma's affair than he let on. It was his silence that made Sarah feel the need to focus more closely on him. One night, Sarah decided to follow David's movements. In doing so, she discovered that David had a habit of visiting an old warehouse near the town, where he would spend hours whenever he was feeling stressed. When Sarah approached the warehouse, she felt an eerie and mysterious atmosphere surrounding the place. She stepped inside and found a collection of documents related to Jack Thompson, Grace, Michael, and Emma. On David's desk were handwritten notes detailing the interactions between the key players, proving that he had been watching them for a long time. Sarah knew something wasn't right. Upon closer inspection, she found an unsent letter. In the letter, David confessed to Emma that he knew about her relationship with Jack. Even more frightening, David had not only known, but he had planned Jack's murder from the very beginning. The letter revealed a horrifying truth. David Miller had been planning to kill Jack Thompson for a long time, not out of jealousy or revenge for Emma, but because he wanted to control everything and protect his family's honor. He knew about Grace's affair with his son, Michael, but instead of stopping it, he used the situation to create a perfect conspiracy. David intended to use the affair between Michael and Grace as a smokescreen, making everyone believe it was a crime of passion. David had meticulously prepared everything. He knew Jack wouldn't easily relinquish control of his assets, and the divorce from Grace could complicate matters even further. So, he decided to act before things got out of hand. On the night of Jack's murder, David snuck into the Thompson house while Grace was away. He attacked Jack from behind with a bedside lamp, delivering a fatal blow. Then, he tried to clean up the evidence, but it wasn't perfect. A few drops of blood had escaped, leaving traces that the police later found. David's motives were not just to protect his family's honor, but also to hide the truth about Michael's affair with Grace. He believed that if this affair were exposed, Michael would be ruined, and his entire family's reputation would never recover. By killing Jack, David thought he could control the situation, keeping Michael and Grace out of suspicion and protecting Emma from shame. However, Detective Sarah Collins wasn't easily fooled. When she cross-referenced the evidence from the warehouse with what she had already gathered, Sarah realized that everything started to fall into place. The faint fingerprints on the lamp, the drops of blood in the bedroom, and the secret emails between Jack and Emma were all pieces of the puzzle leading to David. He had acted not only out of love for his wife, but also out of a wounded sense of family pride and honor. Sarah knew she had to arrest David before he could flee or commit any further crimes. She immediately called in the police to arrest him at his home. When David was taken into custody, he did not resist, remaining silent with cold, emotionless eyes. He had already known that his plan had ultimately failed. The case seemed to have reached its conclusion. But Sarah still felt that something hadn't fully come to light. What truly motivated David wasn't just family honor, but a deep obsession with power and control. After David Miller's arrest, the truth slowly emerged in a dramatic trial in Cedar Grove. Detective Sarah Collins, the lead investigator, presented a series of irrefutable evidence detailing David's meticulous and malicious plan. This evidence included unsent letters and secret diaries, in which David had recorded his observations of Grace, Michael, and Jack. Fingerprints found on the bedside lamp at the crime scene, along with the bloodstains David couldn't clean up, all led to an undeniable conclusion. David was the true culprit. David stood before the court, silent and cold. He showed no remorse and didn't contest any of the charges. When his lawyer attempted to argue that David had acted out of anger and desperation to protect his family, David remained motionless, as if he had long accepted his fate. Grace Thompson and Michael Miller, who had been swept into this whirlwind of crime, now had to face the painful truth. Grace, looking haggard and worn out, confessed to her affair with Michael but denied any intent to murder Jack. She admitted that her marriage to Jack had long been dead and that her relationship with Michael had been an escape from her harsh reality. Michael couldn't control his emotions during the trial. He broke down in tears, confessing that he had been drawn to Grace and never imagined that things would end in such tragedy. Although he wasn't directly involved in Jack's death, Michael felt responsible for pushing events toward their catastrophic end. David was sentenced to life imprisonment for premeditated murder and for attempting to cover up the crime. He didn't contest the sentence, seeming ready to accept this outcome as a release from his own torment. For David, power and control were everything. But in the end, he couldn't control his own fate. Emma Miller, David's wife, who Sarah had discovered had been involved with Jack, left town immediately after the trial. Her life had been destroyed by the secrets and betrayal she had hidden for years. Emma couldn't face the judgmental eyes of the people of Cedar Grove and went into seclusion, carrying her guilt for the rest of her life. Cedar Grove could never return to the peace it once knew. The murder and the dark secrets surrounding the Thompson and Miller families left an indelible scar on the community. The residents, who had once revered the Thompson family, now felt betrayed and had lost their faith in what they had once considered a symbol of perfection and success. The Thompson family's home, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood abandoned, a monument to its downfall. After closing the case, Sarah Collins couldn't stop thinking about the wrong choices and the motives behind every action of those involved. She knew that if Grace, Michael, or David had made just one different decision, their lives might have taken a completely different course. But in the end, they had all been caught in the vortex of power, love, and betrayal, and none of them could escape its consequences. The case was over, but its shadow still loomed over Cedar Grove, leaving a bitter lesson that not everything is as it seems. Even the most seemingly perfect families can hide the darkest secrets, and wrong choices can lead to consequences that cannot be undone.